Among our visitors were also the chiefs of the tribes about Peshawar, some respectable Durrani and Persian merchants, the lower class of courtiers, and the agents of the great lords. Most of them were agreeable and conversable people, from whom much local information was to be gained. The general curiosity to see us, the distinction of being received by us, and the hope of profiting by our liberality, indeed brought many more visitors than we could admit, and our gates were always surrounded by numbers of the lower orders, whom it required the vigour of 2 of the king's Kapuchis, or porters, to keep from forcing an entrance. Among the visits I paid, I must not omit one to a celebrated saint named Sheikh Iwaz, who was often visited by the king and prime minister, neither of whom ever would be seated in his presence till repeatedly commanded. I paid my visit to him in his little garden, where I perceived a number of well-dressed people approaching at a distance, and was going to salute them, when somebody close to me bade me welcome, on which I looked and saw an old man dressed like a labourer who seemed to have been digging in the garden. This was the saint, and the others were men of high rank who stood at a distance from respect. Among them was a young man who was brother to the queen and son to Wufadar Khan, formerly vizier. The sheikh made us sit down upon the clods which had just been turned up, and began to converse very agreeably on all subjects, except religion. He said he heard the people about Peshawar had been mean enough to importune me for presents, and said that the Afghan chiefs had become such a set of scoundrels that he was ashamed of them. He, however, praised the king. He talked readily and fluently, gave himself no airs of a holy man, and showed no affectation, except in lamenting that he had nothing in the house to offer us, and proposing to send to a cook shop for a dinner to entertain us with. There was another celebrated dervish who declined my visit, saying that he had renounced the world and was entirely engaged in prayer and meditation. I sent him a large present in money, begging him to give it in charity and to pray for the king. He peremptorily refused the money, but prayed for the king and for me, and sent a grateful message for my attention. I have now come to a point in my narrative where some account of the state of affairs at the court is necessary to explain my own proceedings. Shah Shujah ul-Mulk had succeeded to his half-brother Shah Mahmud, who was deposed in consequence of a popular insurrection. He had reigned about 6 years when I entered his kingdom, and as he had quashed an unexpected rebellion of his own vizier about a year before, he was considered as very firmly established on the throne, and shortly before my arrival, Shah Mahmud, assisted by Futteh Khan, head of the clan of Baruxias, had made a feeble attempt to recover the crown. The king had, however, succeeded in repressing his first attempt at insurrection in the west, and felt so secure from his designs that he moved east to Peshawar, whence he immediately dispatched Akram Khan, with all the force he could collect, against Kashmir, then held by a son of the rebellious vizier. Not long after their march, news arrived of the capture of Kandahar by Shah Mahmud, which at first occasioned some depression, but that was removed by favourable reports from the west. At the same time, news daily arrived of Akram Khan's successful progress, and all Peshawar was in daily expectation of the fall of Kashmir and the return of the army, which would have been attended with the immediate dispersion of the rebels in the west. All these hopes were quashed by intelligence which was received on the 23rd of April of the entire defeat and destruction of Akram Khan's army. That minister had reposed great confidence in Motawalli, the hill chief of Muzaffarabad, and had depended on him for supplies and guides. At the same time, his ungovernable pride and avarice led him to offend this very man, in whose hands he had put the safety of his whole army. The effect of these mistakes was soon felt in the want of supplies, but Akram had now arrived at the last pass, which, though defended by a wall and towers, would probably have soon been carried, had the assailants been animated by that spirit which has always enabled the needy armies of the West to force the entrance of this rich valley. Akram, however, lent an ear to the persuasions of Motawalli, who undertook to show him a pass by which he might turn the flank of the enemy's work. Accordingly, the army marched off from the front of the entrenchment and moved up a valley, securing the mountains on each side by parties of Khyberee and Gilji infantry. Its march was, however, soon discovered, and its infantry outnumbered and driven in addition to which it was ascertained or rumoured that the upper part of the valley was choked with impassable snow. Akram Khan now lost all confidence. He remained for a day in the valley without supplies and exposed to the fire of the enemy's infantry, which was disheartening to his troops, though too distant to be injurious. This situation produced many desertions, which added to the perfidy of Motawalli, completed Akram's alarm, and, knowing how unpopular he was in the army, he began to fear that he would be seized and delivered to the chief of Kashmir, the disgrace and death of whose father he had occasioned. The result was a resolution to fly, and, accordingly, in the course of the night, all the chiefs abandoned the army, and each separately endeavoured to effect his escape through the passes of the mountains. Most of them were plundered by Motawalli's mountaineers before they passed Muzaffarabad, and Akram himself is said to have been surrounded, and only to have escaped by scattering pieces of gold among the plunderers and flying during the scramble. At length he crossed the Indus and reached the town of Akora, where he received those who went to meet him without the smallest abatement of his former pride. The troops, when deserted by their chiefs, for the most part laid down their arms. Some endeavoured to force their way through the hills, but shared the fate of their superiors. Of the whole army, not above 2,000 men arrived at Peshawar, dismounted, disarmed, and almost naked. This disaster, great as it was exaggerated when first heard of at Peshawar. The whole army was said to be annihilated, Akram Khan was missing, and Mudad Khan had deserted. At the same time, authentic intelligence arrived of the advance of Shah Mahmud and of the capture of Kabul, to which a report was added of the immediate advance of the enemy towards Peshawar. Some of the neighbouring tribes who were inclined to Mahmud were also said to be armed and ready to start up at a moment's warning. The troops were represented as on the eve of a mutiny, and the king, it was rumoured, had sent off his most valuable jewels and was about to fly from the city. Certain it is that for some time there never was a night on which one could be confident that there would not be a revolution before morning. Our anxiety on that head was somewhat augmented by the frank avowal of our Maimandar that in the event of any general confusion we should be attacked by the Khyberee's other plunderers without delay. Nevertheless, the city remained as quiet as on the first day. People talked openly of the state of things, but nobody acted as if a revolution were at hand. This panic at length subsided. The enemy were found to have remained at Kabul, and it was now certain that they were disputing among themselves. Akram Khan had also returned, and had begun to assemble the wreck of the Kashmir army, together with such troops as had been left at Peshawar or could now be raised. The king's situation, however, was still far from promising. Everything depended on money, with which he was very ill provided. Many of the chiefs with him could at once have remedied this evil, but few were sufficiently zealous to do so, and even Akram Khan, who had occasioned most of the king's misfortunes, and who knew that he must stand or fall with his master, was so blinded by his avarice that he refused to give or lend any part of the large treasures which he had inherited from his father, and amassed himself. The character of this minister was one great cause of the king's weakness. Though so deficient in political courage, even his enemies allowed that he was endowed with the greatest personal bravery, and that he was sincere in his attachments, true to his word, a strict observer of justice, and perfectly direct and open in his dealings. But, on the other hand, he was extremely avaricious, and of a haughty, sullen and suspicious temper, arrogant and irritable to those around him, difficult of access, and tenacious of respect. In my own intercourse with him, however, I found him to possess all the good qualities ascribed to him, without any one of the bad. Akram Khan was a very strong man, upwards of 6 feet high, with a sullen countenance, and an apparent disposition to taciturnity. This, however, wore off, and he talked without reserve of his defeat, which he ascribed to treachery in his army, and of all other subjects which were likely to interest. His dress was very simple, and his manners plain. With Akram Khan, all the Durrani Khans who had been with the army had returned, and I now exchanged visits with them all. I found their society very pleasant. They generally talked of hunting and hawking, horses and arms, asked questions about the climate and productions of England and India, and explained those of their own country. They also sometimes told little anecdotes or recounted events in which they had been engaged. Presents were always interchanged after the visits. I sent the Durranis articles of European or Indian manufacture, and they gave me horses, dogs, and hawks. Soon after the arrival of these Khans, and before the first alarm created by the bad news was over, a Hindu was seized in one of the passes on the way to Kabul, and a report immediately spread through Peshawar that he was a servant of mine, charged with letters to Shah Mahmud, begging him to push on to Peshawar, and engaging for the capture of the Bala Hisar and the seizure of Shah Shujah. This story was accompanied by a rumour that the king was on the point of giving up our property to plunder. The whole town was, in consequence, in a ferment. People were running up and down in all directions, getting their arms in order and lighting their matches, and a great mob soon assembled at our gates. All the gentlemen of the embassy were sitting at this time in the hall, receiving company, but Captain Pitman quietly doubled the guards and took other measures of defence. In the meantime, Mullah Jafar and another of our friends arrived in much alarm, and there was a great deal of whispering and agitation. But when things were at their height, Akram Khan happened to come in on a visit, and it may be supposed that the crowd did not remain long after. Nothing else took place that need be mentioned here, except that on the 4th of June, the party of troops with the mission was exercised in honour of His Majesty's birthday. Akram Khan and many other persons of all ranks were present. The spot was admirably calculated for a small body, being a green plain, confined by hillocks. The Durranis were greatly delighted with the exhibition, and even the king viewed it through a telescope from the top of the Bala Hisar. During this time, the king was exerting himself to get together an army. Many of the troops who had been taken in Kashmir were allowed to return, but half of them were dismounted and disarmed, and the rest were full of gratitude to the governor of Kashmir, and more inclined to him than to the king. The army, indeed, was generally disaffected. The chiefs were disgusted with Akram Khan, and the soldiers enraged at their disgraces and disasters, and distressed for want of pay. They scarcely attempted to conceal this disposition, but openly accosted gentlemen of the mission in the streets, abusing Akram Khan, and not even sparing the king. Akram's weight had indeed declined even with His Majesty, and Abul Hosn Khan used sometimes to express his hopes of being able to get him removed, and the direction of affairs given to Mudud Khan. The effect of this change was felt in the king's councils, where I was at all times treated with great attention, but where, at present, nobody had a preponderating influence. Consequently, nothing was ever brought to a decision at their debates, which often ended in mutual reproach and recrimination. It was at length determined to march for Kabul, and the king's tents were ordered to move out. A gun was fired at an hour fixed by the Imam, and at the same time the king's Munzil Numal was erected. This was a kind of obelisk formed by canvas fixed in a particular manner round a pole about 30 feet high, at the top of which was a large silver ball. The canvas itself was red. Its use was to mark the encamping ground. The king's tents were afterwards sent out. The finest was about 30 feet broad and very long. It was formed of wooden frames, in which were placed canvas panels and compartments of various colours. The roof was pink and was supported by 4 poles, each of which had a silver ball at the top. Behind this were many other tents of a smaller size, and the whole was surrounded by a wall of cotton screens. 2 sets of tents like this always accompany the king, and with each is a wooden house 2 stories high, which 100 workmen can pitch in an hour. The town was full of bustle. A number of troops were encamped under the Bala Hissar, and the streets were crowded with horsemen. But the tranquillity of the city was not otherwise disturbed. At length, the king moved out to his camp, and, as it was not the policy of the British government to take any share in the civil war, it became necessary to fix on a spot to which the mission should retire. All the ministers agreed in representing that Peshawar was an unfit place to remain in during troubled times, and Akram Khan, after considering and rejecting a plan for our retiring into the mountains of the Yusufzais, offered to allow us to occupy the fort of Attock, which would be perfectly safe in all extremities. This was declined, and it was fixed that we should go to the eastern frontier, whither the king's family was also to be sent. This being arranged, we went on the 12th of June to the king's camp to take leave. The streets were more crowded than ever, and we saw many parties of cavalry and some excellent horses. The king's tents were pitched in a garden on the banks of a pond, round which was a terrace of masonry. The great tent occupied one side of the pond. On 2 of the other sides were the corns of the court, the greater on the king's right and the lesser on his left. The 4th side was open, so as to allow of the king's seeing down a street formed by 2 ranks of guards, which extended from the pond to the principal gate of the garden. We were introduced by a side gate and led up to the right hand, where we stood with all the great khans. While we were there, several parties who had come over from the enemy were successively introduced. They entered by the gate opposite the king's tent, where they were drawn up in a line, their names were announced, and they went through the usual form of praying for the king, after which they retired. At the end of each prayer, the whole of the guards called out, "Ameen, Amen." When this was over, we were requested to go up close to the king, accompanied by Akram and Muddad Khan. The king then addressed me, saying that we must be unaccustomed to so unsettled a government as his was at present, and that although he parted with us with reluctance, yet he was unwilling to expose us to the inconvenience of a campaign, and he therefore wished us to retire to some place on the frontier, from which we could either join him or return to India, as suited our convenience. In the course of the conversation which followed, His Majesty spoke in high terms of the British nation, and hoped he should be able to carry us with him to Kandahar and Herat. When he had concluded, Akram Khan, Muddad Khan, and the king's Imam severally made speeches addressed to the king, commenting on what His Majesty had said, and enlarging on the justice, good faith, and military reputation of the British, and on the advantages to be derived from an alliance with such a people. At this audience, the king wore a high cap of plain red cloth, with a black velvet band round the bottom. He had no jewels on. A mace, a sword, and a carbine lay before him on a cushion. Several persons were in the tent with him, fanning him by turns, and among them was Mir Abul Husn Khan. The king looked ill and haggard, as if exhausted by the heat and by anxiety of mind. On the 2 next days, we had farewell visits from Akram Khan and many other persons, and on the 14th, in the evening, we commenced our march for the Indus. The king's affairs were now in a highly prosperous condition. He had equipped a tolerable army and was ready to move against the enemy, whose dissensions had come to such pitch that Futteh Khan had seized his rival in the midst of the court, and had thus occasioned the defection of 2 of the great Durrani clans. Accordingly, all parties seemed to look forward with certainty to the success of Shah Shujah's cause, an event which was called for by the prayers of the people, to whom the Shah's moderation and justice had greatly endeared him. Our first march was to Chumkuni, a village only 4 miles from Peshawar. The country was now becoming a little unsettled, and, instead of a few footpads who used to plunder single men when we first arrived, there were now bands of robbers who carried off several loaded camels that were going to camp without a guard. The accountant of the mission allowed a mule of his own, loaded with rupees to the value of £1,000, and also with fine shawls, to loiter behind. The mule, having thrown the muleteer, and laid him senseless on the ground, ran through the crowd, and shook off its valuable burthen, which was instantly pillaged by the bystanders. On the 15th we continued our march. The appearance of our line was now much altered by the great proportion of mules and ponies employed in carrying the baggage, by the number of good horses which were to be seen mounted or led, by the use of Persian and Uzbek saddles and bridles, as well as of boots and mantles among the upper classes of our Indian attendants, and by the number of Peshawaris and other people who spoke Persian that now accompanied us in various capacities. A number of persons followed us from the city as far as this day's march, some to show their attention, but more to importune us for presents, of which all the people at Peshawar, except the highest classes, were inordinately greedy. Our march on this day lay through a good deal of wood of tamarisk trees. On the 16th we left the wood and marched over an extensive plain of green turf, only varied by the low plant called Jew by the Afghans, and Kari Shuture by the Persians, and by a plant very common about Peshawar, which much resembles that in English gardens, called devil in the bush. We encamped on a very agreeable spot, where a point covered with green sod and shaded by some trees projects into the deep, clear, and rapid stream of the Kabul River. Here, about 400 yards broad, on the opposite shore is the village of Nusheira. Many Yusufzais crossed the river to see us. I was much struck on this day with the long duration of the twilight, which, with the length of the day, is novel to a traveller from India. Day broke, on the 16th of June, at 3:15, and the sun did not rise till within 10 minutes of 5. Our next march was along the Kabul River to Akora, the principal town of the Kutuks, where we saw Asaf Khan, the chief, and many of the principal men of the tribe. Asaf Khan was a very respectable-looking man, very handsomely dressed and well attended. The others were mostly elderly men, dressed in dark blue or black, with fair complexions, long beards, and reverend countenances. The whole of our march had hitherto been between a range of hills on the south and the Kabul River on the north, which had approached each other at Nusheira, so as only to leave room to encamp between them. On the march of the 18th, which reached to the Indus, the hills came close to the river of Kabul, so that we were obliged to cross them. They belonged to the same range which we passed near Kohat, and we were reminded that they contained the same inhabitants by finding Kutuk guards posted in the pass to protect our baggage from the Khyberis. From the top of the pass, we saw to the north the Indus, issuing in a vast number of channels from a mass of thick vapour that scarce allowed us to see the mountains through which it had flowed. It, however, formed but 2 channels when it reached the hill where we stood, at the foot of which it was joined by the Kabul River. There were numerous rocks at the point of junction, and, as both rivers ran with great impetuosity, the sight and the sound produced by the dashing of their waters were very noble. After this the rivers were collected into one channel and ran through the mountains in a deep but narrow stream between high banks of perpendicular rock. The fort of Attock was also plainly seen from this, and on descending we encamped on a spot opposite to that place. The Indus was here about 260 yards broad, but too deep and rapid to be correctly sounded. Its banks are of black stone, polished by the force of the stream, and by the white sand which it carries along with it, so as to shine like black marble, and always to look as if it were wet. In the midst are the famous rocks of Jalalia and Kemalia, but the whirlpool, of which we had heard so much, did not rage at the season when we passed. The fort of Attock stood on a low hillock on the left bank. It is a parallelogram, of which the shortest faces, those parallel to the river, are about 400 yards long, the others are of twice that length. The walls are of polished stone, but though the place makes a handsome show, it is commanded by a rough hill, only divided from it by a ravine, and, being on a slope, almost the whole of the interior and the reverse of the walls on 3 faces are visible from the opposite bank. The town, though now decayed, was once very considerable. The village at which we encamped was a small one, distinguished for a sort of fort, said to be built by Nadir Shah, and for a fine aqueduct made by some former chiefs of the Kutuks to water the neighbouring lands. Notwithstanding the violence of the stream, the boats passed quicker here than at any river we had yet crossed. We also saw many persons crossing or floating down the river on the skins of oxen inflated, on which they rode astride, but with most of their bodies in the water. This contrivance is also made use of in the Oxus, and appears to be as ancient as the days of Alexander. We crossed on the 20th, passed through the fort, and were welcomed to India by all the Afghans of our party. We halted for 2 days at Attock and were visited by the chiefs of the neighbourhood. The governor of the province was a respectable Durrani, with the complexion and dress of Khorasan. But the people of the country, whether Yusufzais or Durranis, for many of that tribe have been settled here for 7 generations, had a dress and appearance resembling those of Indians. One man struck me particularly, who belonged to the Kautirs, an Indian tribe who inhabit the almost inaccessible hills to the southeast of Attock. He was very black with a long beard, and had the shy look of a savage, without any appearance of ferocity. He had dirty clothes, with a small turban, strangely put on, and clutched his beard as he sat, like the picture of Judas Iscariot in Lavater. The heat during the last night of our stay at Attock was extreme. A strong hot wind blew all night over the low hills to the south of our camp, and the thermometer was at 96 degrees between 3 and 4 in the morning. From Attock, the mission made 3 marches to Husn Abdul. The first was over the plain of Chuk, which was entirely covered with wheat and nearly flat, except from a hillock here and there, on which was always a village. The other 2 were through a country which rose into high waves, with deep ravines in the hollows. It was generally dry and uncultivated. The country began to resemble Hindustan, although a willow was still now and then observed. The people partook of the change. Not a villager in 100 could speak Persian, and the Afghans had lost the use of the Pushtu language. They struck me as the rudest and most ignorant people I had yet seen. I was accompanied from Attock by Habib Khan, the chief of Buraun and Husn Abdul. He had about 100 horse, all dressed in the Indian way, with white turbans, white coats of quilted cotton, Indian hilts to their swords, Indian furniture on their horses, and no boots. But they all wore either cuirasses of leather or shirts of mail, and carried long spears. Their long beards and wild air distinguished them at once from Hindustanis, and their appearance was altogether peculiar. Amidst all these signs of India, the valley of Husn Abdul recalled to our recollection the country we had left. It had indeed been famous in all ages for its beauty, and had been a favoured resting place of the great Moguls on their annual migrations to Kashmir. Nor could there have been a scene better fitted for the enjoyment of their easy and luxurious grandeur. The influence of the rains of Hindustan, which now began to reach us, had cooled the air, and given it a peculiar softness and pleasantness, which disposed us to a more perfect enjoyment of the beauties of the place. There also was a garden which resembled and almost equalled that of Cohort. Near this was the tomb of Husn Abdul, from which the place is named. It is partly composed of marble and stands in a square enclosure, within which are 2 very fine old cypresses of remarkable height. Husn, whose surname Abdul is the Pushtu for mad, was a famous saint of Kandahar, where he is known by the name of Baba Wuli. About 2 miles off was a royal garden, now gone to decay. There was something melancholy and desolate in everything about it, which was scarce less impressive than its original splendour. It contained some deep and extensive basins, filled with the pure water of these hills, some ruined buildings, one of which was remarkably elegant. And here we, for the last time, saw the plane tree, which forms the favourite ornament of all the gardens of the West. It was at Husn Abdul that the mission was to have remained till the fate of the kingdom of Kabul was decided. But before it reached that place, I had received orders to return to the British provinces, and had announced my recall to the king, It was, however, necessary to await His Majesty's answer, and also to settle with the Sikhs about a passage through their territories, which, at first, they positively refused. This occasioned a halt of 10 days, during which time I was visited by some chiefs of the neighbourhood, and received a letter from the Sultan of the Gukkas, accompanied by a vast quantity of grapes which grow wild in his country. The Gukkas are well known for the trouble they used to occasion to the great Mughals. They once possessed the whole country between the Indus and Hydaspes, but have been driven out by the Sikhs. They have still a high military reputation. I also received a visit from Mullah Jafar, who had come with the king's haram to Attock, whence they were to fly to the Sikh country, if the king's affairs took an unfavourable turn. Soon after, I received my answer from the king, and, everything being settled with the Sikhs, I was preparing to commence my march, when one night I was surprised to hear that the Peshawar, or advanced tents of the haram, had arrived close to camp. This boded no good, and reports were soon circulated that the king had been defeated. The next day showed a great change in the state of affairs, the report being now generally believed. All the king's partisans were depressed, while some adversaries of his started up where they were little expected. Mullah Jafar arrived in the course of this day and produced a letter from the king, in which he said that his troops had behaved with fidelity, but that he was defeated, that such and such chiefs were safe, and that no expense was to be spared in conveying the haram to a place of security. It turned out that the army was attacked by a small force under Futteh Khan, as it was straggling on, mixed with the baggage, after a very long march through the mountains. The king and Akram Khan were in the rear, but the latter, who had his armour on, rode straight to the scene of action. He had not above 100 or 200 men when he set out, and most of these were left behind as he advanced. The day was decided before he arrived, but he, nevertheless, pushed on, and had penetrated to the place where Futteh Khan was when he was overpowered and slain, after a very brave resistance. The king fled to the mountains, from whence he soon after issued to take Kandahar. That enterprise was also ultimately unsuccessful. He has made 2 more attempts since then, and has twice taken Peshawar, but is now once more in exile. On the morning after the bad news, July 4th, we set out on our march, as had been previously settled. We first went to the camp of the Haram to take leave of Mir Abdul Hussain Khan. The camp contained numerous enclosures of serapurdas, or canvas screens, and a vast number of kajawas, or camel panniers, in which women travel, and we wandered long through them before we could find the Khan. He was much less depressed than I had expected, but talked without reserve of the hopelessness of the king's affairs, and of the uncertainty of the reception the Haram would meet with from the Sikhs. We took melancholy leave, and crossing the hills to the south of the valley, we quitted the king of Kabul's dominions. We were received by a party of Sikhs soon after we passed their frontier, and, from this time, we met with no trace of Durrani language or manners among the people. Though pleased with the Sikhs on the borders, we could not but be struck with the rough manners, the barbarous language, and the naked bodies of the people among whom we were come. Nor was it with any partiality that we perceived an increased resemblance to the customs of Hindustan. In 3 marches we reached Rawalpindi. The country was uncultivated and much intersected by deep and extensive ravines. In the course of the 2nd march, we passed a ridge of hills, which would have been difficult to cross had not the Mughal emperors, with their wonted magnificence, cut a road through the solid rock. This road is about 3/4 of a mile long, and paved with great masses of a hard blue stone, well fitted in, and still in good repair. The town of Rawalpindi is large and populous. It is a pretty place, is composed of terraced houses, and is very like a town west of the Indus. The country round is open, scattered with single hills, and tolerably cultivated. We halted here 6 days to get Ranjit Singh's leave to advance. We now saw a good deal of the Sikhs, whom we found disposed to be civil, and by no means unpleasing. They were manly in their appearance, and were tall and thin, though muscular. They wore little clothes, their legs, half their thighs, and generally their arms and bodies, being bare. But they had often large scarfs, thrown loosely over one shoulder. Their turbans were not large, but high, and rather flattened in front. Their beards, and the hair on their heads and bodies, are never touched by scissors. They generally carry matchlocks, or bows, the better sort generally bows, and never pay a visit without a fine one in their hand, and an embroidered quiver by their side. They speak Punjabi, and sometimes attempt Hindustani, but I seldom understood them without an interpreter. Persian was quite unknown. They do not know the name of the Duranis, though that tribe has often conquered their country. They either call them by the general name of Khorassanis or by the erroneous one of Gilji. Juan Singh, the chief of Rawalpindi and one of the greatest in the Punjab, visited me here. He was a plain, civil man, only distinguished from his followers by his decent appearance and manners. His numerous companions and attendants sat down promiscuously in a circle, and seemed all on a footing of equality. A Sikh in my service once dined with this Sirdar, and found at least 250 guests, all the soldiers in his immediate employ, partaking of his fare every day. When we wished to return his visit, we found that he and all his attendants were drunk. But, about 4 in the afternoon, he was reported sober, and received us in a little smoky hovel in a small garden, his people in confusion as before. Most of them continued to sit, while he got up to receive us. While we were at Rawalpindi, the Haram overtook us, and with it came Shah Shujah. We visited him on the 10th of July, and were not a little interested by the sight of a monarch, whose reputation at one time spread so wide both in Persia and India. We found him seated on a plain couch in a neat but not a large tent spread with carpets and felts. We stood opposite to him till he desired us to be seated. His dress was plain, a white mantle faced with Persian brocade and a black shawl turban, but his appearance was very kingly. He looked about 40 when we saw him. He had a fine face and person. His voice and manner strongly resembled Shah Shujah's, but he was taller, and had a longer, more regular face and a finer beard. He had by no means the appearance of a blind man. His eyes, though plainly injured, retained black enough to give vivacity to his countenance, and he always turned them towards the person with whom he was conversing. He had, however, some appearance of dejection and melancholy. After we were seated, a long silence ensued, which Shah Shujah broke by speaking of his brother's misfortunes, and saying they had prevented his showing us the attention he otherwise would. He then spoke of the state of affairs, and expressed his hopes of a change. He said, such reverses were the common portion of kings, and mentioned the historical accounts of astonishing revolutions in the fortunes of various princes, particularly in that of Tamerlane. Had he gone over all the history of Asia, he could scarcely have discovered a more remarkable instance of the mutability of fortune than he himself presented, blind, dethroned, and exiled, in a country which he had twice subdued. We marched from Rawalpindi on the 12th of July and reached the Hydaspes in 10 marches. The first 6 were, like those already mentioned, uncultivated country, much cut with deep ravines and torrent courses, and, like the whole country between the Hydaspes and Indus, pastured on by droves of horses of a very good breed. The part most to the east was better cultivated than the rest. In the first of these marches we crossed the Swan, a large rivulet, which, though only up to our horses' girths, was so rapid as scarcely to be fordable. Several of our camels were swept down by the stream. The last 4 marches were among hills, interspersed with country like that already described. The high hills on the north were generally concealed by fogs, but sometimes we saw them rising to a great height above the clouds. The whole of our journey across the tract between the Indus and Hydaspes was about 160 miles, for which space the country is among the strongest I have ever seen. The difficulty of our passage across it was increased by heavy rain. On one occasion, the rearguard, with some gentlemen of the mission, were cut off from the rest by the swelling of a brook, which had not been a foot deep when they began to cross. It came down with surprising violence, carrying away some loaded camels that were crossing at the time, and rising about 10 feet within a minute. Nothing could be grander than this torrent. Such was its force that it ran in waves like the sea, and rose against the bank in a ridge like the surf on the coast of Coromandel. While in the hilly country, our road sometimes lay through the beds of torrents like this, between moderately high hills, which, though by no means so striking as the passes of the same sort in Afghanistan, were no less dangerous. In one of these defiles, the mission was stopped by a body of 6 who occupied the hills and commenced an attack upon us. First, by rolling down large stones, and at last by opening a fire, which was immediately returned. Their fire was at length put a stop to by the interposition of the 6 who attended the mission on the part of Dewan Singh. Unfortunately not, till one man had been killed in the valley, and Captain Pitman shot through the arm while ascending the hill at the head of a party of sepoys. The most remarkable sight we met with in this part, and perhaps in the whole of our journey, was an edifice about 15 miles from Banda, our second march from Rawalpindi. The heaviness of the rain prevented our marching from that place on the day after we reached it, and as we were near the place which Major Wilford supposes to have been the site of Taxila, a party determined to set out in quest of the ruins of that city. In the course of a circuit of about 40 miles, we saw the ruins of some Gukka towns destroyed by the 6, and those of some others still more ancient, which had suffered the same fate from the Mussulmans. We also saw 1 or 2 caravanserais, here called rabouts, and we heard of an obelisk of a single stone 50 or 60 feet high at a place called Raji, which was too distant to visit. But we met with no ruins of such antiquity as to have any pretensions to a connection with Taxila. We, however, at length discovered a remarkable building, which seemed at first to be a cupola, but when approached, was found to be a solid structure on a low artificial mound. The height from the top of the mound to the top of the building was about 70 feet, and the circumference was found to be 150 paces. It was built of large pieces of a hard stone common in the neighbourhood, which appeared to be composed of petrified vegetable matter, mixed with smaller pieces of a sandy stone. The greater part of the outside was cased with the first mentioned stone, cut quite smooth, and the whole seemed intended to have been thus faced, though it had either been left incomplete or the casing had fallen down. The plan of the whole could, however, be easily discovered. Some broad steps, now mostly ruined, led to the base of the pile. Round the base is a moulding on which are pilasters about 4 feet high and 6 feet asunder. These have plain capitals and support a cornice marked with parallel lines and beadings. The whole of this may be 7 or 8 feet high, from the uppermost step to the top of the cornice. The building then retires, leaving a ledge of a foot or 2 broad, from which rises a perpendicular wall about 6 feet high. About a foot above the ledge is a fillet, formed by stones projecting a very little from the wall, and at the top of the wall is a more projecting cornice, from which the sphere springs. The stones of the facing are about 3 feet and a half long, and 1.5 broad, and are so put in that the ends only are exposed. The top is flat, and on it the foundations of walls are discoverable, enclosing a space of 11 paces long by 5 broad. A third of this area is cut off by the foundation of a cross wall. There was nothing at all Hindu in the appearance of this building. Most of the party thought it decidedly Grecian. It was indeed as like Grecian architecture as any building which Europeans, in remote parts of the country, could now construct by the hands of unpractised native builders. The natives called it the tope of Mount Yala, and said it was built by the gods. Many bushes and one pretty large banyan tree grow out of the building. Before we reached the Hydaspes, we had a view of the famous fort of Rhotus, but it was at a great distance, owing to our having left the main road and crossed 15 or 16 miles lower down than the usual ferry at Jhelum. Rohtas we understood to be an extensive but strong fort on a low hill. We crossed the Hydaspes at Jalalpur in the course of 5 days, from the 22nd of July to the 26th inclusive. I was greatly struck with the difference between the banks of this river. The left bank had all the characteristics of the plains of India. It was indeed as flat and as rich as Bengal, which it greatly resembled. The right bank, on the contrary, was formed by the end of the range of salt hills formerly seen at Calabar, and had an air of extreme ruggedness and wildness that must inspire a fearful presentiment of the country he was entering into the mind of a traveller from the east. The hills still retain the red colour for which they were so remarkable where we crossed them before. They came to the edge of the river, which being also divided by islands, presents exactly the appearance one expects from the accounts of the ancients. So precisely does Quintus Curtius's description of the scene of Porus's battle correspond with the part of the Hydaspes where we crossed, that several gentlemen of the mission, who read the passage on the spot, were persuaded that it referred to the very place before their eyes. After passing the Hydaspes, we continued our march across the Punjab, which occupied from the 26th of July till the 29th of August. My account of this part of the journey need not be long. As far west as Lahore has been visited by English gentlemen, and Sir John Malcolm has already given all that is desirable to know respecting the Sikhs, the most remarkable part of the population. The fertility of the Punjab appears to have been too much extolled by our geographers. Except near rivers, no part of it will bear a comparison with the British provinces in Hindustan, and still less with Bengal, which it has been thought to resemble. In the part I passed through, the soil was generally sandy, and by no means rich. The country nearer the hills was said to be better, and that, further to the south, worse. Of the 4 divisions of the Punjab east of the Hydaspes, the 2 nearest to that river are chiefly pastured on by herds of oxen and buffaloes, and that most to the east, towards the Hysadrus or Sutlej, though most sterile, is best cultivated. The 2 former are quite flat. The latter is wavy, but there is not a hill to the east of the Hydaspes, and rarely a tree, except of the dwarfish race of Babul. On the whole, not a third of the country we saw was cultivated. It, however, contained many fine villages and some large towns, but most of the latter bore strong marks of decay. Umritsar alone, the sacred city of the Sikhs, and lately the seat of their national councils, appeared to be increasing. On the contrary, Lahore is hastening fast to ruin, but the marble domes and minarets of the mosques, the lofty walls of the fort, the massy terraces of the garden of Shalimar, the splendid mausoleum of the Emperor Jehangir, and the numberless inferior tombs and places of worship that surround the town still render it an object of curiosity and admiration. The inhabitants become more and more like the natives of Hindustan as we move towards the east. The most numerous class were the Jats, and next to them the Hindus. The Sikhs, though the masters of the country, were few in number. We often made a whole march without seeing one, and they nowhere bore any proportion to the rest of the population. After crossing the Hydaspes, we found the Sikhs unmannerly and sullen, probably from political causes, for they are naturally a merry people, careless, childish, and easily amused, fond of hunting, and given up to drinking and debauchery. Almost the whole of the Punjab belongs to Ranjit Singh, who in 1805 was but one of many chiefs, but who, when we passed, had acquired the sovereignty of all the Sikhs in the Punjab and was assuming the title of king. Towards the east, his territories are bounded by states under the protection of the British, but on all the other sides, he is busied in subjugating his weak neighbours by the same mixture of force and craft that he so successfully employed against the chiefs of his own nation. On crossing the Sutlej, we reached the British cantonment of Ludhiana, from whence the mission proceeded straight to Delhi, a distance of 200 miles.